This is the Agile Uprising Podcast.
Hello and welcome. We are at the next installation of the Agile Manifesto author review. I'm your host today, Ryan Lockard. Joining me from the Agile Uprising is James Gifford. And we're very happy today to be welcoming on Andy Hunt. Andy, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me, guys. Delighted to be here.
So happy to be talking with you. So we've been going through this exercise with a bunch of your cohorts from 2001 in Snowbird, and just making an exercise to figure out the history of the manifesto, what you all were individually doing before 2001, the event itself, and then going forward. We're somewhere in the sweet middle spot right now. I've spoken to a few of them, still have a few more to go. But I guess to get us rolling professionally, what were you up to leading up to Snowbird, starting at whatever year and job you want?
So, good question. So this was effectively the tail end of the 90s. This was 2001. We were just recovering from, the Y2K debacle that didn't quite happen. But starting in the mid 90s, an old college friend of mine called up out of the blue, one of those random calls, and said he had this impossible deadline for this project they were working on. And it was the hardest of hard deadlines, in that this piece of old NCR equipment that they were using was being taken out of service on this given date, and it was running, $1 billion of transactions through it every day, and they had to replace it, and we had this long, and there's no way any sane person could actually do this. So he thought of me and gave me a call. Well, I said sure. I was not particularly happy with my captive employment job at the time, so I said, I'd started doing some consulting, so let's do this full time. So joined the project, went out and joined them, and that's where I met this other crazy guy that he called up, a fellow named Dave Thomas, and that's how we met. So we met on this insane project, and pumped out a whole bunch. I've got it cited somewhere, but I think it was, 50, 100,000 lines of C code, some ridiculous number in some very short amount of time. And we met the deadline. Everyone was delighted. The project went really well. And Dave and I decided that we shared many philosophies of how software should work and how programmers should work and how the industry should be. And that was a novel experience for both of us. We had both worked at a lot of other places where that was not the case. Each one of us was the lone voice of reason in some larger sea. Mm. So we started doing working together, doing consultant gigs, going out and helping folks. And over the course of the next couple of years of doing that, what we discovered was that each client we'd go into was pretty much doing the exact same wrong things. It was very, very similar problems, similar pathologies, however you want to phrase it. And so we'd go into, start an engagement and have to spend the first part of any particular engagement just kind of getting them up to speed and saying, okay, no, you got to do this. You got to do this other thing. You're doing this wrong. That's wrong. Do this differently. Mm-hmm. So just as a kind of an aid to ourselves, we thought, well, what we should do is we should write a white paper, because we keep telling these folks the same things. We keep using the same little anecdotes. We should just write some white paper and send it on ahead for each of our consulting engagements. So we started doing that, and my brother-in-law at the time said, you guys really should publish that. And look at whatever publisher you respect the most, whoever you've got the most on your bookshelf, and go and approach them. Start at the top, which was kind of funny because we were thinking, well, if we wrote something, actually wrote a book, we knew nothing about publishing, nothing about authoring. This, we were computer consultants, right? What do we know? But my brother-in-law said, go find the best publisher you respect, and start with that. So we did, and at the time, all of our books were Addison Wesley titles. The Gang of Four Patterns book, all the sort of stuff. So we tightened up the manuscript such as we had at the time and sent it off to Addison Wesley, expecting them to say, "Yeah, kids, go play in your sandbox. Leave this for the grown-ups." And surprised, they came back and said, "Love it. Let's publish it. Let's go."
Wow.
And that became the Pragmatic Programmer.
So that was around 99 then.
Yeah. Yep. So we wrote Pragmatic Programmer mostly in earnest in sort of 98, 99. It published that fall, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. I think it has a 2000 copyright date, but you're right around that period. So that had just come out. Kent Beck's Extreme Programming book had just come out around that same time frame. And that was kind of how this all started to gel. Our book was not on methodology. Dave and I have never claimed to be methodologists. That's not really our bag. But what we wanted to do in the Pragmatic Programmer book was kind of highlight all the things you needed to know about as a programmer, whether it was a personal habit, personal practice, design techniques, what we would now call sort of agile practices and kind of team techniques, that sort of thing. So we kind of tried to cover a wide gamut of things that we thought were important at the time. And of course, as history has shown out, those some 70 tips or whatever we have in the book there are still important. And people still reach for that and cite that as a classic. It comes up on ACM's top 10 lists and all these kinds of things, which was really sort of beginner's luck from our point of view. I mean, again, we were just trying to cover, this is the stuff as working programmers, this is the stuff we think is important. Mm. There was a natural overlap there from a lot of the things that we were thinking about and talking about with what the Scrum folks were doing, what the Extreme Programming folks were doing, what the FD types were doing, what Alistair was doing with his Crystal stuff. So there was a good bit of overlap there in what folks were thinking and talking about. And I was at it must have been the 2000 OOPSLA. It was in Miami, maybe, I think. And I'm walking around looking at stuff and ran into Bob Martin. And Bob and I get to talking, as happens. And Bob mentioned this kind of consultant workshop, retreat, summit sort of meeting. This sort of consultants retreat, workshop, summit kind of meeting to talk about these new lightweight methods that we're starting to be of interest. Mm-hmm. And would I be interested in participating? So I said, sure. And that was not uncommon in that day and age. I think they're less common these days where people don't invite me. But back then it was more common for a bunch of consultants or interested folks to sort of get together and have, some kind of a meeting to talk about something interesting. Mm-hmm. I'd been to a total of, maybe a half dozen over a span of some years. And so at that point, it's just like, oh yeah, this is fine. We're getting together somewhere, and we'll talk about these kinds of things. I was sort of interested in promoting the Pragmatic Programmer book and getting these ideas wider acceptance. So it's kind of fit in naturally with what Dave and I were doing. So we did. There was a lot of discussion. There was a mailing list set up. I think Ward had started a wiki for us, of course, at that time, so we could put some ideas up and get some things out there. There was a lot of discussion about where to hold it. Right. The crowd saying Caribbean's awful nice this time of year, but Snowbird won out. Skiers, I guess. Yeah.
So I appreciate what you said, that you're not a methodologist. But if we just take a quick step back to that NCR project, what obviously there's probably not a straightforward answer, but what methodology would you say you were closest to following in that space? Or framed differently, what was it that made the affinity between you and Dave Thomas emerge? Like, what was it that you guys were doing together that kind of made that brotherhood happen?
We made it up as we went along, and we were both okay with that. And we knew that that's the correct way to do most projects. And that was the big difference. Because of the time pressure involved, there was none of this sort of management overreach where you had to have everything sketched out in, nauseating detail months ahead of time. There was no time for this 2 to 4 years of analysis paralysis.
You actually had to get down and do work.
We had to get it done. We had to get it done by this date, which was not that. It was 4 or 6 months off, something like that. It wasn't. This was not like a couple years out. This was like, it's spring and this fall, this machine's getting unplugged and carted off.
And were you guys were you guys co-located for this effort, or was it virtual?
Yep, no, it was co-located. We flew and spent a good bit of time on site in an office that was approximately the size of an ingenerous broom closet. No windows, that kind of thing. But what made it work? Well, there's several things that made it work, but the biggest one I think relevant to this discussion was the fact that across the hall from us we had the domain expert, the subject matter expert. We had this woman named Judy who knew everything about how the system worked. She was the beyond like the chief user. She was like the caretaker of it. So she could tell us that, okay, when this message comes through, when this packet arrives, the specs say it's supposed to do this, that, and the other thing. It doesn't. It does this and this other thing over here. And, the spec's wrong, and this is this. And this says it does this. What we really wanted to do is this. So we could get the really straight from the horse's mouth, to use phrase, the requirements and the wants and needs of what the system had to do literally across the hall.
And is it safe to assume that's
Hey, she was perfectly okay with us interrupting her, whatever she was doing, something on fire, and we'd be like, I have a question. She'd be like, all right, you guys stop, hold. Yes. Oh, it should do this. Boom, boom, boom. Great. Thanks. Go back to, stomping out the flaming ducks or whatever she needed to do.
Up to that point in your career, had you actually had that type of a tight feedback loop and that level of exposure to the subject matter expert like you did with Judy?
No, that was, I think that was probably the first and maybe even still the best example of that.
That's awesome.
Anything we'd done before that had some number of, levels removed from it. I did a lot of work for the New York Stock Exchange at one point, and that wasn't bad. You'd have to travel by train for 2 hours to get down to the exchange and talk to the guy on the floor who was in charge of the project. He was helpful and he could answer things, but it wasn't exactly co-located. It was more of a meeting. So that slowed things down a little bit. Some other work I'd done for more shrink wrap commercial projects. Rarely saw the users. We rarely heard about them. It was 2 or 3 levels of indirection of, oh, they want this, trust me. Maybe.
Yeah.
So that was all the other efforts up to that point had really been, more farther removed. This was a model, a paragon of direct user involvement. And it worked great. It absolutely worked fantastic.
One last question about the NCR project, just being a fledgling student of the history of Dave Thomas and the various places he's lived and worked. What city was the broom closet located?
This was down in Florida. It was near Orlando. I remember exactly what, they got little counties and cities all over the place, but it was in the Orlando area, if I remember right. I know it was Florida.
Yeah.
Somewhere down in there. It's like that map of the country where, all you see on the East Coast is New York's the top half, Florida's the bottom, California's on the left, and there's this blob in the middle.
Yeah. So you're in one of the, at least one of the identifiable areas. So you had that going. The nicest broom closet in Florida. So before I took us down that path, you were actually talking about the the interaction and introduction that you had to Snowbird. I think it was almost everybody seems to credit Bob Martin for harnessing the 17 of you guys and kind of starting the conversation. I believe Alistair and Jim were the proponents for Snowbird, simply just because that's where they were. And Willow was the other one that keeps coming up, but Snowbird won out. If you don't mind, just mentally, just try to put yourself back into that first minute when you walked into that. Well, I think it was actually the night before the first day you all met each other, but the morning of the first meeting, the first organized event in that room. Just try to remember what the smells are, what the light level was, where the chairs were, the whiteboard, the flip charts, all that good stuff, right? What do you remember? Like when it first kicked off, when you started seeing these guys who you may have met, some others you knew by name, some maybe from voice. What was your first moment of, okay, here I am? Did it feel magical? Like what was going through your head?
I think there was a fair bit of magic, if you will, in the air, in that you had a group here of really smart people. Folks who were methodologists, had written extensively, had studied these things, most of whom agreed with most of our positions. There was a lot of general consensus just going in on many things. So, in a way, I think it felt to me, at least, it's like, this is really cool. This is sort of the top of your tribe. These are kind of the people thinking, along the same lines as each other. And isn't this cool? We can all get together and actually meet face to face and talk about these things. So when the meeting started off, if I remember right, and if my notes here are vaguely correct, the leading proponents of each of the established methods got a chance to sort of do a little song and dance, just to kind of say, that this is our thing and here's what it's about and here's what's important about it. The overarching idea, I guess, that Bob was trying to put forth was trying to get everyone to find that common ground. See, what is it that we could all agree on and say, yes, this is really the core of this idea of lightweight methods. Mm-hmm. That was the only name we had up to that point, which no one really liked, but you had to call it something.
Right.
Sort of starting with that. And I've actually got a bit of some scrappy notes here, and I'll send you a copy of these.
Appreciate it. Actually, but as we get into that, I mean, when you walked into the room, I really do want to hear about the meat of it, but I want to make sure I set context and set the stage appropriately. Otherwise, I'll listen to this later and be frustrated with myself. 16 other gentlemen in the room. Of those, I'm assuming you knew most, if not all, at least by name, and you had met some of them in person, obviously Dave and Bob, as you had mentioned. When you walked in, was there anyone in the room that you had never heard of, or somebody that you were more unfamiliar with?
Yeah, probably 3 or 4 were either somewhere between completely unknown to me to vaguely unknown to me. Arlo from the DSDM consortium. I'd never heard of DSDM. I'd never heard of him. There was a handful like that where just hadn't been on my radar. Kind of thing. But the vast majority I certainly had at least heard of, if not had already, spoken to and had some interaction with.
Cool. And then specifically to those frameworks, you had XP, you had DSDM, you had Crystal, Scrum. I think I hit them all. Were there any that, obviously you've made it clear that you were not a methodologist, but were you familiar, other than DSDM, since you already said you were not, were you familiar with the others going in, or were you actually learning as they're up there talking about their different frameworks?
To varying degrees, I was pretty much aware of the rest, just from general background research that I had done, and just keeping it on top of things. I knew less about like the TogetherSoft FDD kind of business.
John Kearns type stuff.
Yeah, that pretty much at the time I kind of only knew by name. I wasn't really up on the details of that. I'd really had liked Alistair's Surviving Object-Oriented Projects book. I thought that was, that was kind of his proto-methodology book before it sort of grew up and became a whole methodology. But I really liked the thoughts that he had in there. I thought they were really good insights and good observations. I really liked Jim Highsmith's work in his writing, and he brought a lot of really good ideas to the table that I think were in that bucket of things that we should have done more with and maybe didn't, that we kind of left on the table. And I think a lot of that came from sort of his outlook on the world.
Cool. So I think now skipping hopefully into some of your notes here, but also just going along memory lane. One of the early exercises that I understand is you guys tried to create some sort of a living agenda. And the method of that was to jot down ideas on cards and toss those cards into a circle or onto the table or something along those lines. Does this strike any memory in your head?
Very possible. I say very possible because it's been, how many years? 17 years, 15?
I think we're saying 15, so you could tell me if I'm wrong.
15 years worth of a lot of Post-it notes and cards and boards and, sticky notes. And that certainly became a much more common thing of doing that sort of agenda on the fly and using dot votes up on the whiteboard. Yeah. I lumped that together as a sort of, cheap office supply consultant tricks.
Yeah. Well, I think that where I was headed with the question and trying to jog your memory is what would you have written on one of those cards? And I guess scratching the outer reaches of your brain, as you were walking in, what do you think you would have written on one of those cards, or what do you remember actually standing up and saying, "Hey guys, I'm really passionate about this"? Selling 16 copies of your book probably wasn't on the card.
No. That's a really good question. And I think at that point, certainly at the very beginning, I don't think I had a burning agenda that I wanted to deposit and put forth. Dave and I said at the time, and I think it was accurate, that we really felt that our role there, not being methodologists and not having any particular methodology to push or side with, we kind of felt our role was to watch out for the rights and the position of the average developer, the man in the street kind of thing, and making sure that whatever came out of this would be reasonable and acceptable, and from a developer's point of view, that this would be okay. So going in, I started off, I guess, with more of the idea of watching to see what direction it would take, rather than trying to influence that or push it in any particular direction or other.
That's actually a really interesting perspective. Based on what you said, is it safe to say that you almost immediately knew this thing was going to have legs and it had the potential to impact the everyman or every person, developer and software person?
Absolutely. And I've got notes here from the very beginning where we were talking about being this level of activity in the field and what we were trying to do here. I actually wrote the sentence, "The prospects are tantalizing." Public awareness is low. So this is a real, we collectively felt, whoever put forth the idea, that, this was a really good time because awareness was so low that, we could come out and make a bold statement and say, here's how it should be, and that would get some traction.
The prospects are tantalizing. I'm writing that down. I may have to steal that. You should have copywritten it.
Well, that's part of it. So the notes that I jogged down here, and I'll read you a few of these as we go along. But many of these, I unfortunately didn't credit and I don't know whether it was, some random neuron that fired in my own brain that I jotted down, whether somebody had said it in the meeting and I jotted it down. I don't know the source for many of these, but
enough time has passed. You can claim them all as your own.
there you go. Yeah, I wrote the whole thing. Well, somebody, and I wrote down here, and I wish I could remember who say this. I'm would even guess it might have been Bob, but somebody said that UML was looked at on as training wheels to a more professional process. Maybe, I don't know, but somebody was ranking on that, and that was, again, you got to look at the time. A lot of this was still very reactionary against the very heavyweight, very stiff, unyielding processes that were being used at the time.
Are you specifically taught? I mean, just to pick an evil overlord, are we looking at Rational and Rupp, or?
Sure.
Yeah.
Let's. I think that was definitely a target because, despite whatever best intentions Rumbaugh and Bush and the folks you are there had starting in on it, and you see this even with Agile now. Despite best intentions, you start with something and it became weaponized. It became this real horror out in the world of folks just getting so torqued up in trying to do the process right that they never got software working.
From what I'm showing my age here because right around the time you guys were having this conference, I was graduating from college, so I'm
cool.
I didn't have to live with it so bad, but I did actually deal with it to a degree, and I just remember the acronyms and the need for an index of acronyms to understand how humans were communicating in Ruppese. It was incredible.
Yeah, and you want to talk about a huge, red flag warning sign. There's one right there. As soon as you start laying on the acronyms, you've kind of lost the battle for communication.
Yeah.
Ironically, and I'd like to think we have made a lot of progress in the ensuing decade and a half, but we're so far from done. I was talking with Jared the other day, and he's got a client that had literally been stuck in full-time hard analysis for 2.5 years.
Yeah.
Kind of soft analysis for some number of years before that.
Yeah.
And we went in and shared with them, our ideas of tracer bullet development and sort of modern things that we like to see. And within 6 weeks, they had a demo and they had code going out the door.
It's incredible. So back in Snowbird, I'm sorry, I got to get through a couple other questions again, or future Ryan will be very frustrated with current Ryan.
It's always the case, isn't it?
Yeah, no matter what I do, there's always that hindsight that kicks you. So I understand you guys were very very thoughtful in the way that you structured your schedule. You had 2 sessions per day broken up with gaps of time that were either filled by sitting around the lounge having a beer, going up the mountain and skiing, hanging out in a hot tub, or I think Bob said he filled the off time by going back to his room and writing. What was Andy Hunt doing when you guys hit your breaks?
We were in the sit around and chat crowd for most of that. I had not been skiing some years before that, and I didn't think that was really a proper venue to start up again. I did start skiing again a couple of years after that, but I didn't think that would be really appropriate.
Nice.
Start off on the hard slopes. This is one of those discussions that comes up whenever you have or host a conference or anything of that nature. Is we've really come to the realization, especially now, that the most valuable part of a conference or a user group or get together is the unstructured time of letting people just sit and talk with each other and have stuff happen. I was actually just at a conference a couple of weeks ago where they had really significant breaks in between the tracks. It wasn't minutes, it was 45 minutes in between each track, sort of thing. And I think lunch was 2 hours. 2.5 hours. So significant time to mix and mingle, chat up folks, see what everyone's on to. And that really fit in with the sort of ideas of emergence and just allow space for things to happen that's not planned down to the minute. Well, for these 10 minutes, we're going to talk about, continuous builds. And for this 30 minutes, we're going to talk about pair programming or whatever it might. It was much more, try to be much more organic than that.
I'm glad you say that, because I'm pretty sure I'm stealing this term from somebody else, but the idea of mental hygiene being built in is a great concept, and it's one that I push on when I'm coaching with my teams or when I'm working with my developers. However, looking back to your broom closet story, I'd say that that's not the most important hygiene given that period of time. You probably should just make sure the other hygiene is handled before you worry about the mental hygiene because of the close quarters. But
in Florida, yeah.
In Florida, yeah. It's a little swampy. As you're going through, and I call the 4 bullets, the values. I'm not sure if that's the proper term, but you know what I mean when I say the 4 bullets. The process from which they emerged and the beautiful double positive that they actually turned into be. Do you have any memory of how that process happened? I'm not asking you to name names or anything like that, but just how did the group come together and make such a beautiful thing actually distill out and still hold true 15 years removed?
There was a fair bit of arguing. There was passionate discussion. The reason that I think the top 4 lines or that sort of first page came together was that really was a distillation of the stuff that everyone in the room could sort of get behind and agree on. So if there was something that only 3 or 4 people thought were important, it didn't bubble up. It didn't make it that far. I don't remember offhand the physical mechanism that we used to do this. I'm sure it involved whiteboards and cards, cards of some sort. I do know that the principles, the longer list, felt to me to be a little bit more random. That felt to be a little bit more like, well, this is sort of a good idea. Should we stick this in? Yeah, okay. And some wordsmithing, and it would get stuck in. And it's funny because I cite this a lot. You can tell where there was disagreement that the wording gets a lot more weaselly all of a sudden. So, case in point, the third principle listed on agilemanifesto.org says, deliver working software frequently from a couple of weeks to a couple of months with a preference to the shorter time scale. Mm-hmm. Weasel words, right? And clearly there was disagreement there. There were folks who said, oh, a couple months is fine. And then the rest were going, no, that's stupid. That's too long. You can't let it go that long. You need the tight feedback loops. You have Scrum saying 30 days, period. Mm-hmm. Why are we still talking about this?
It's interesting. Of all you guys, I think with maybe 1 or 2 exceptions, that's the one. That's the one that I would have loved to have been in the room just for that, however long that was.
No one liked it. I mean, this is where, for the most part, we were able to not make it look like a committee effectively put this together, but there's a couple points where it pokes out, and I think that's probably the clearest example where you obviously had people arguing over the details of, yes, frequently is great. We could all get behind frequently, but what does frequently mean? Mm-hmm. And that's where there was a lot more discrepancy in approach. But having said that, folks, I think, got the idea that, we sat around talking about technical practices a lot, and we didn't. It's not, we didn't sit there and discuss pair programming or, burn down charts, or if they even existed at the time. But, we didn't talk about details particularly all that much. It was generally at a much higher level. And probably for that reason, because even something as simple as, well, what does frequently mean? Well, everyone had different ideas. Mm-hmm. There were definitely different camps about that. But despite that, the stuff that bubbled up to the very top of the manifesto, the X over Y form, that was really sort of unassailable. Everybody got behind those and was like, well, yes, duh. of course.
Yeah.
Talk about this other stuff. But what I personally find interesting is a couple things. First, how many people have not even read the manifesto? There was somebody had on Twitter the other day. They had 6 candidates for an Agile management position, project management position, and all of them had extensive Agile experience on their resume. Not one of them had read the manifesto. Not a one, which is a little appalling. The other thing is appalling is the folks who read it and miss some of the most important parts.
Yes. Okay.
Continue.
Continue.
Let me tell you what I think are the 3 most important parts about the manifesto that people glaze right over.
Okay.
The very first line says, we are uncovering better ways of developing. We haven't found them all. This is not a done deal. We're figuring it out. In fact, I've got a note here. The first version that I wrote down in my notebook said, we are figuring out better ways of developing software by doing it. And then I see it's crossed out and it says uncovering, which was the version that made it out to the world. But the first version said, we are figuring out better ways. And we're still figuring out. We should still be figuring out. It's not a done deal. Scrum is not the end of the road for Agile or XP or Lean or whatever. It's a process of figuring it out.
Okay. What's number 2?
And number 2, of the 4 bullets, there actually are no bullets, but for lack of a better...
That's my fault. I put that out there.
Individuals and interactions over processes and tools. You could ignore everything else and just focus on that and reap benefit 1,000-fold. Because people read this, go, hey, that's great. Individuals and interactions, all right? We're going to be Agile. What tool do you use? Let's use Jira.
Yeah. Yep.
And then they fall right into the trap every single time.
It's shocking how many of these certified practitioners, if you gave them index cards and a blank wall, would not be able to figure it out.
No, they can't. And that's leads me straight into point 3 of we follow these principles. The very last one, which is possibly the most important one, save the best for last, says, and I quote from a reading from the manifesto, at regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective, then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. This does not say you should refactor your code regularly. I mean, you should. That's great, but that's not what this is talking about. This is talking about the team changing its process, changing its behavior as a result of inspection and adaptation. Now, everyone will crow, inspect and adapt. Sure, yeah, we got that. And they don't.
Mm-hmm.
Have any of the major Agile methods changed in any significant way in 15 years?
I'm biting my tongue.
Are the Agile methods themselves Agile?
So let me play devil's advocate for a minute and point out the manifesto itself has not been amended. The manifesto has not a comma, not a period, not a parentheses.
Oh, and that was deliberate. That part was deliberate. The thinking went that this represented the collective 17 folks. This represented our best ideas, our best philosophies at the time. Mm-hmm. And that this was very much a snapshot. That this should be and should always remain a snapshot of these folks at this point in history, and that's what it is. There was some talk at the meeting about, what do we want to do going forward? Do we want to maintain this? Do we want to update it? Do we want to improve on it? Do we want to make a book about it? What should happen to this over time? And the winning argument was a snapshot. And it will stay stuck in amber as a stake in the ground that this was what we all thought at this point.
Yep. And I think the beautiful thing is because of the compromise and because of, again, the double positive structure and then the deep core of the principles being written the way they were, it still holds true. As much as it is a snapshot, as much as I agree with everything you just said, I don't know that it needs to be amended. It's opened enough.
Yeah, and I think that's part of why it's been successful, and oft quoted, occasionally even read. I think because it is still very much applicable. And honestly, if we actually did the things that we said in here, we'd be fine. We would solve so many problems.
So let's chase that rabbit for a minute. Then you came out of Snowbird, and it almost this again maybe just revisionist history here, but it seemed like it took fire straight away. It wasn't a slow burn. Once you guys came out and there was a label to apply to this level of thinking, this term Agile, and that started becoming available in the market, it took off, right? And to what degree were you exposed and engaged in that launching point? And what were your thoughts as it just quickly went?
I agree. I think I certainly remember it that way too, that it really sort of exploded on the scene. And that again was somewhat deliberate, because when everyone left, our individual missions were, okay, you go spread this amongst your followers, your people, your tribe, your corner of the world. Had this kind of 17-fold dissemination right out of the gate, with some big names in the industry. Your Martin Fowlers, your Bob Martins. You had folks here who had a big voice, with people ready to listen, all pointing toward this. This was back in the day when dinosaurs grazed. You actually had magazines that would cover this, and did. And surprisingly, we got coverage beyond just the sort of Dr. Dobbs Journal or SD Times or whatever was around. I think Byte had bit the dust by then. But whatever was around was covering it. But then even mainstream press like The Economist and things like that were picking up on this. Ooh, hey, look, there's something new here. And it was keenly in everyone's interest, because developing software as a corporate owner, as a stakeholder, developing software sucks. It's risky. It's a pain. You don't get what you want. You can blow through a ton of cash really easily without knowing what you're doing. So even a whiff of, hey, we've got something that might be better. It's like, oh, I'm interested. I'd like to hear about that. And sticking a name to it, I think, is absolutely critical. And there was a fair bit of discussion about what to name it. Again, we went in with the idea that it was the Lightweight Methods conference. I sent you all a screenshot earlier of the schedule in the hotel for the day.
Yeah,
you had to book it. You had to call it something. So Lightweight Methods, which is what we had. Everyone had been using. Sort of initially going in contrast to the very ponderous, heavyweight, very bureaucratic approaches that come up before that. But in group conversation, I think no one really liked the name. Lightweight sounded like a heavyweight's going to come and clean your clock.
Right.
It had a connotation of lack of strength or staying power. So a number of alternatives were bandied about, and I have a list of them somewhere. It's not in this material, but there were other ideas, responsive development, maybe.
I remember. I think Jim was pushing for adaptive pretty hard,
and that was what he had. He had a book on adaptive software. I don't remember where it came out in time, whether it predated this or postdated it,
right.
But that was very much an idea he was into. And again, I think anything along the line of adaptive or responsive or anything with that sort of connotation might have been a better choice in hindsight, because one of the central messages that people lose is this idea of adaptation and changing your approach as. So the fact that everybody kind of lost that in the sun, maybe we should have emphasized that a bit more.
I think I don't disagree with your idea that that is lost, but I think what we're saying is we commercialize the word agile, because even the word agile is a strong adjective, strong synonym for adaptive. It's just we've beaten that term agile down into meaning a very discrete thing. But it no longer means nimbleness. It no longer means the ability to adapt and to change, right?
It's. I mean, my sarcastic and cynical view is it's been beaten to mean we do half of Scrum poorly and we use Jira.
If we want to get sarcastic and cynical, this will go off the rails because I live in that world too.
It's unfortunate. But there's vendor studies out there, there's surveys, and people look, and an unfortunate percent of people who think that they are doing Agile basically have a 3-hour stand-up meeting, which is just an old-fashioned meeting, and they've got a backlog, a list of to-do items. So they have a to-do list and a meeting, and they're like, "Hey, we're Agile."
Yeah. So I want to make sure that I'm respectful of your time, and it sounds like we're stepping into the what are we hoping for the future of Agile piece, but I also want to make sure I give you a good chunk of time to talk a little bit about Grows. So speaking about the emerging Agile practitioners, right? It is an industry, whether we want to label it as such or not. It's on almost every job spec I've ever seen now in the tech space. Must be an Agile practitioner.
And that's a two-edged sword, because one of the main reasons I started the idea of Grows and made the Grows method, even stuck a TM on it, was because I'd run into a bunch of people who said, we want to do this thing to make our development, our project go better. We have this better way of doing it, but the bosses won't let us do it because it's not canonical Agile. It's not part of Scrum. It's not part of XP. It's not part of Lean. They didn't read it in the book. Therefore, you are not allowed to do it because it's not real. So my first thing was, okay, fine. Now it's real. It's called Grows, and you can do whatever the hell you want, because the idea is, from the first line of the manifesto, we are uncovering better ways of developing software. It's an active sentence. We are still doing it.
So
going on.
So for the sake of anyone that may not be familiar with Grows, you and Jared Richardson are principally accountable for the proliferation of this idea. Can you just share, I don't know if the elevator pitch is the right term, but just what is Grows to somebody that's not familiar?
So the idea behind Grows came from frustration with people who had beaten the word Agile into submission to the point where it lost the important meaning behind it of being able to grow software, slowly and steadily, being able to grow your own skills. This whole idea of growth for both code and process and people, I felt had been lost. I wanted to provide a brand to say, we are figuring it out, which means taking the idea of experimentation and promoting that to a first-class part of the method. Everybody says, oh, inspect and adapt. Well, that's lovely. But what you really have to do is actually do something first. You have to experiment. You have to try something, see how it went, get feedback, act on that, rinse and repeat. So the main thrusts behind the Grows method, which you can find, it's all free and online at method.com. The idea is to take the idea of experiment as a first level thing, use the idea of tracer bullets, which came from the original Pragmatic Programmer book, and it's just the idea of starting with that thin walking skeleton that goes all the way through the code base on day one to tell the world, and then you beef it up as you go along. The idea of including all the rest of the organization. We say that we want to talk to stakeholders. We want to work with users, but we don't tell them how to work with us. We say we want user involvement. Great. Have you trained them? Have you given them practices to follow? No. We want these other folks to work with us, and we never told them how. So inclusiveness is the third thing. And then what glues it all together is using a skill model as a framework for the whole thing. So back in about 2008, I'd been giving talks for several years before that on various issues of kind of cognition and neuroscience-y learning kind of business. And so in 2008, I wrote the book Pragmatic Thinking and Learning, because I thought that, one of the most important things we have to do in software development is learn continuously, all the time, from everything. New tech, we have to learn how our team works. We have to learn, the properties of the software that we're developing as it's emerging. We're learning all the time, and that's not something we talk about a lot. So in the course of research for that book, I came across several interesting ideas, one of which is the Dreyfus model of skill acquisition. And, in a nutshell, that showed me what was really wrong with a lot of Agile adoption was, here you've got these really smart guys sitting down saying, here's a method, do all these things. And then some company gets that and says, okay, guys, starting tomorrow, we're all Agile. We changed all of your titles. So instead of project manager, now you're Scrum Master, and we're doing everything completely differently. At 8 a.m., go. And of course, it falls on its face. Right? It's because that's not how it works.
But that's when you hire an Agile coach, right?
Yeah, right. Something like that. So what in reality, what you need to do is, because you're starting now with beginners at this skill, you might be an expert programmer, but you're a novice at this particular skill of this particular method. You're a beginner. Beginners need concrete steps. Do this, do that, and do the other thing. Fine. So you have to start with that, but then you've got to move up from there. What the researchers found, the Dreyfus brothers found in their research, was that if you have someone who's a proficient or expert level and you make them follow the rules, it degrades their performance down to that of a novice. So we have this kind of two-edged sword here. You've got experts that you have to let work by intuition and not slavishly follow the rules, but you've got beginners where they have to follow the rules in order to be productive at all. And there's these 5 stages that you sort of go through to get from one to the other. So in the Grows method, we start off with stage 1 being the beginner basics. And here's where the irony comes in. The basics include what I call sort of safety and hygiene. You're opening a hospital in some impoverished part of the country. The first thing you do is get people to learn to wash their hands appropriately, right? Simple hygiene. And that's a big deal. It's such a big deal. I didn't realize this, but even in major hospitals, it's someone's job to watch the doctors and make sure they wash their hands appropriately. That's like a reporting function.
I work in the clinical space. I'm familiar.
I was stunned. I was like, wow, really? So for us, our version of washing the hands is it inversion control? Right? Do you have continuous builds? I've had, to this day, I've got people say, oh, yes, we have continuous builds. It runs on Friday. So
I like how continuous builds is part of step 1. It's incredible how not standard that is.
And it absolutely has to be. So this is one of the big pushes behind Grows is if you cannot automatically and reliably get software out your pipeline, for continuous delivery, if you can't produce it mechanically, then all the rest of the stuff about talking to users and getting all touchy-feely and coming up with the best, none of that matters. Because you're not going to get the damn thing out the door.
Right.
So step 1, you've got to get the mechanics, the stupid, simple, version control, continuous build, integration, testing kind of world. You've got to get that absolutely brain dead, just unfailingly reliable right out of the gate. That's your first step, is to get the mechanics done. Okay. Then we can go on and talk about involving other people and getting feedback and doing sort of the more interesting things. But just the 2 simple ideas of making sure that you've got the mechanical basis covered first, and then going on doing the other stuff right there. Again, you talk to folks that say, oh yeah, we're doing Agile, and they don't have they don't have continuous builds. We talked to somebody a couple of years ago. They said what they used for version control was Microsoft Outlook.
Oh my God.
And what they would do is they'd email each other the code at the end of the day. And there'd be a version, on the server.
The version is the timestamp on the email?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, there's stuff that we absolutely take for granted. And this is what I find interesting in the sort of, all the different methods that are out there. If you look at Scrum is a lightweight project management framework. Right?
100%, yep.
It assumes you're doing something akin to XP's practices underneath it. It makes that assumption. You need something like this that we're not going to talk about because you already got that, but you need something like this. XP assumes you're doing the very low-level technical practices like version control and that sort of stuff underneath what they've got. So you've got this kind of almost layer cake of assumptions, and at the end of the day, yes, you need all of that.
Yep.
You absolutely have to have that. You have to have a good conversational rapport with the stakeholders, the users, however you're getting your requirements learning accomplished, and you've got to have the mechanic in place. So our view with Grows is, if nothing else, if you can adopt level 1 of Grows, you're already light years ahead of all those, fragile folks who don't have even that much working yet.
Sign me up, sir. I'm drinking your Kool-Aid.
And that's the easy part. And then, of course, it gets more interesting as you go from there.
Yeah.
And emphasizing feedback, right? Everyone, again, this was certainly the intent behind the Agile Manifesto, the idea of delivering working software frequently, working together daily with business people. The rationale behind many of the principles in the manifesto is how quickly can we get good, reliable feedback on what we're doing? Because the faster we get the feedback, the faster we'll know if we're going in the right direction or not. And then we can fix it if we're not, while it's still relatively cheap to do so. That was a major thrust of the manifesto. I think it was Kent Beck was really fond of drawing those cost of change curves at conferences for some years. And again, it's like that's a major lesson. It's a major point that I think has kind of gotten lost in the fog when you see people doing practices that do not encourage rapid feedback.
Yeah. I think I have one final question for you before we try to wrap this up. And it's going to be disconnected from every other question I've asked you to this point. It's just general. What is the last book you picked up or the last book that you completed? Where is your learning focus these days?
The last technical book that I've read?
Well, actually, I might have lied. There may be more than one question. You just jarred my memory on something else. But not even necessarily technical. The last book that sparked your interest. Help everyone understand what scratches your brain.
The last book that I read is called Now, about the physics of time and time dilation and relativity and Planck's constant and all this sort of stuff. And the reason I was reading that had to do with my project this last summer, which I warned you I'd tell you about.
Yeah, that was what jarred my memory.
I had this kind of random thought in the spring of this idea for a story. And I'd never written fiction before. Resumes don't count, but
How about project plans? You never wrote a project plan?
That's fiction writing. There you go. So I had this idea for a story, and I thought, well, let me just try this. So I ended up writing a novel. It's about 250 pages, science fiction, and I wanted to write kind of an easy beat. I didn't want one of these really dense, jargon-filled kind of things. I wanted a pragmatic science fiction book, if you will.
Nice.
It's just a nice, easy read, good story, interesting world that I built. And it has been a really remarkable educational adventure for me, because as with most things, you start off, oh, how hard can this be? You know, I'm just going to do this, do that. And as you start getting into it, you know, in a very agile fashion, you realize, oh, I don't know this. I don't know this other thing. I need this. This has taken a different turn from what I thought. You know, so it's been very educational along those lines. I've done a lot more reading on quantum physics than I probably would have otherwise, as one does. And it's great. It's just like, oh, hey, this is research for the book. I need to do this. And so you can, you know, read something completely off in the weeds and characterize it as research. So that works out well.
So is the science fiction book, does it have a title? Has it been published? Can listeners get their hands on it?
It has a title. I'm wrapping it up. There's actually a website for it, which is conglomora.com.
You may want to spell that.
CONGLOMMORA.
Okay.
Mora. And the idea in a nutshell is that the Earth became uninhabitable, and everyone fled in their little ships. And unlike many other sci-fi properties, we didn't find a planet that was suitable. The big generation ships didn't work for us. So everyone's out in their own little ships out at the edge of nothing, and they decide to glue all their ships together, and that becomes our new home. Works out great until the mysterious stranger shows up, and then all hell breaks loose, and we're off to the races. So that's that's in a nutshell.
Safe to say it is not going through the Pragmatic bookshelf. You're probably going to have to find a different publisher.
No, we don't unfortunately don't have the remit to do science fiction or fiction books in general. So this will go somewhere else. I haven't decided yet whether to find an actual, established publisher or just fling it up on Amazon. But
gotcha.
One way or another, there's a mailing list you can sign up there if you're interested, and I'll let y'all know when it's available.
So as we drive this to a close, we plugged the book. Just this week or last week, you guys publicly released Effective Agile Teams, the new website.
Yep. And so the idea there, we started growsmethod.com and put in all the practices that we wanted to define so far. And we've got a lot of work to do on that still. Don't get me wrong. This is very much an experiment itself and a work in progress. But we put up all the practices. There's some videos. There's some lovely figures, all this kind of thing. But what we were discovering was that when people wanted to show this to a stakeholder or to a manager or someone to get buy-in, it was too much detail up front. It was too much to sort of take in comfortably. So we made effectiveagileteams.com as a higher level, here's the benefits. Can your team do these things? And if not, here's the end. Here's how you fix that. 1, 2, 3. Do these 3 things, and use that as kind of a sales pitch to get folks interested in it. Because as a business owner, I mean, I find it personally interesting. As publisher at the Pragmatic Bookshelf for 13 years now. I get to see both ends of this particular deal. I've been a programmer, I've been a consultant, I've been a business owner where I don't care about that stuff. I just need this feature. I just need this to work this way. I just need this thing done. And having to negotiate both ends of that really does give you an appreciation for, what I call the CEO's preferred problem solving model, which is let me write you a check.
Yeah.
Right. I don't care. I don't want to know the details. I don't want to know how you do it. I need this solved. I need a number. Let me put that number on a check. We all go on our merry.
So to get a hold of you guys for Grows Method, you have the Twitter handle @GrowsMethod for that channel. And then the email is admin@growsmethod.com.
Yep, admin@growsmethod.com or sales@growsmethod.com will certainly work for that. My homepage on the web is toolshed.com, so you can reach me at andy@toolshed.com. Toolshed lists all the various projects that I'm working on, things that I've got upcoming talks, that sort of stuff. And then I'm on Twitter @pragmaticandy.
Perfect. Well, Andy, I appreciate your time today, sir. We will be publishing this. I'll make sure I get conglomerate.com to be a well-known website through the Agile Uprising channels. We will also be posting this on coalition.agileuprising.com. And for anyone that wants to follow us on Twitter, it's just at agileuprising.com or at Agile Uprising. So thank you again, Andy. I appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Cool.
This episode of the Agile Uprising podcast is brought to you by Lean TV. Lean TV for the Apple TV allows anyone to run and participate in Lean Coffee-style meetings. This is great for business, brainstorming, family planning, or anything else. Lean TV takes care of the notes, voting, prioritizing, timekeeping, and advancing, all without the need for a meeting facilitator, boards, sticky notes, etc. Hundreds of notes can be written and discarded in an instant. Along with the Apple TV app, there are free companion apps on iOS and Android. No internet connection needed. Visit leantv.io for more info.